Okay. Hey. All right.
Hey,
So we are live streaming now on
great.
YouTube. I couldn't get the Facebook to work, so it's all
Okay.
good. And Stephanie is usually on by now, so I'm not sure what's up with her.
Okay.
But Stephanie will be moderating. She'll field the Q&A. She'll also ask a question of the week, and which gives a minute or two to let people filter in and say hello. I don't know what the question is, so I can't tell. I can't prepare you.
Oh gosh. Okay. I'll look
But
forward
you
to
and I
that.
will go back and forth. You and I and Stephanie will talk about whatever the question is, and then I'll have some introductory notes, and so will Stephanie. And then after I read your bio, then the show is yours.
Oh, great. Okay. I
Nice
did
shirt.
a
Pro sex
little,
ed.
yeah, yeah. Isn't it cool? I had to make sure that I wore it for
Love
this.
it.
It's a Planned Parenthood shirt. I bought
Cool.
it quite a few years ago. It's one of my favorites. I did do a little about me slide. I hope that's still okay, even though you're doing an introduction. I
Yep.
didn't know. So
Yeah,
hopefully.
you could just, as Bill said, and then elaborate as you wish.
Okay, great. Oh, I'm so excited.
Is that okay with you, or do you want me to not?
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's great.
All right. This is real. Hey, let me send her a note.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, she says she's in the waiting room. How's that?
Uh-oh.
Okay, let me go to hang on. And my son is still texting me. Are you done with Spotify?
No, son.
Okay. So I'm gonna start, and then I'll move her in, and we'll start in another minute, but I just want to make sure that we're moving up Stephanie to panelist.
Great. Thanks, Bill.
Hey folks, if you arrived early, we're gonna get started in just a moment. Hey Stephanie.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hey, that was weird. Don't know. That was new. How did your thing go yesterday?
Oh, it went great. Everyone was really happy with the turnout and happy to meet new folks. So,
Oh, that's great. Were you there, Brittany, for the networking thing yesterday?
I wasn't. I'm on West Coast time, so oftentimes I'm still on work hours when these events happen. So I wasn't able to make it, but I hope the next one I will.
Oh, great. All right. Well, it is 7:00, and now, Stephanie, we're going to jump right into the question of the week without any preparation. So whatever you throw at us, we're going to have to roll with.
sure, yeah. So this week is, what was your first job?
First job.
First
Do you remember,
job.
Brittany, what was your first job?
Is this like a full-time job? Is it a part-time job?
Yeah, part-time job. Anything, like as a teenager, young adult.
Oh gosh, I worked at a summer camp actually, and helped put together all the lunches for the kiddos. I think that was my first job. Yeah.
How did you like that?
I loved it. I love working with people. I have quite a background working in the service industry throughout my life, in between, going to school, and I guess I started young, so it was great.
Great. How about you, Stephanie?
I was working at a Stop and Shop actually when I was 16. That was my first job. So definitely learned a lot doing that.
Yeah, those are hard workers, grocery store workers.
For sure, yeah.
I was a stock boy at a uniform store where my mom worked.
Wow.
And that store blew up. Like the building exploded when one person was there and he was severely injured, and we still don't know what happened with that, why that happened. But I'm just glad I wasn't there. And after it blew up, I didn't have a job anymore. But that was my first job.
Oh gosh.
We think that there may have been some, organized crime work going on. I lived in Staten Island, New York. So there might have been something there. Don't know for sure.
Wow, that's an adventure.
So folks, go ahead, jump in the chat and tell us, say hello to each other and tell us about your first jobs as well. And while you do that, we're going to get started with our notes. I'm really excited about tonight's program. But let me start as we usually do with hello and welcome to the Sex Ed Lecture Series. My name is Bill Tavener, and thank you for taking some time out of your day to learn about sex ed. Welcome back to colleagues who have attended before, and if this is your first time with the Sex Ed Lecture Series, welcome. We're really happy to have you here. This is the 127th topic that we've had so far in the series, which has featured 143 experts and thousands of professionals attending. We are pleased to be providing ASECT continuing education credits from the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and as well as CFLE credits from the National Council on Family Relations. If you did not sign up for them, but you'd like them, just send us a note via the chat or an email, and we will make those arrangements for you. So now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for tonight, Stephanie, and she has a few notes for us. Hello, Stephanie.
Hi, Bill, and welcome everyone. So I would just first like to ask you to please use the chat to continue saying hello, respond to the question of the week, which is, what was your first job? Tell us where you're from, use the chat to network, share ideas, and react to our speaker for tonight. And when you do use the chat, just note that it does allow you to either send a comment for everyone to read or directly to someone. So please just be aware of that to make sure that your comments are directed to the people you want seeing them. And if you have a question, please just use the Q&A box and we'll do our best to monitor that for our speaker. And back to you, Bill.
Thank you, Stephanie. So now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Brittany E. Bloom, who holds a PhD in global public health from the joint doctoral program between San Diego State University and the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Bloom's research interests and expertise are in sexual violence prevention and education and post-assault help-seeking behaviors. Welcome, Dr. Bloom.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here. And with that, does that mean I start?
Yep, that's your cue.
That's my cue. Okay, great.
So if you want to put up your slides and then the show is yours.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Bill. I'm here today to present on the responsiveness of sex education to the needs of LGBTQ+ undergraduate students. And though Bill already shared a little bit about me, I always find it useful to just take a moment and talk a little bit about my background and some of the things I'm currently working on, just to orient you all to, what I'm doing, what I'm up to, and maybe facilitate some additional questions later. Somewhat recently, I should first say, my name is Brittany Bloom. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I somewhat recently just graduated with my PhD in public health from the joint doc program between San Diego State University and UC San Diego, as Bill shared. I am always happy to share and think it's important to share that I am a first generation to college student, meaning that neither of my parents went to college. And my experiences as a first gen and low income student in many ways led me to programs and people that supported diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which ultimately really created the lens through which I view public health, violence prevention, and education. And I've been working in violence prevention in some way, shape, or form for about 10 years, whether that be in research, through my volunteerism, through education, both being on the receiving end of education and being an educator myself, and have focused on a whole bunch of topics, including planned teen pregnancy, intimate partner violence, human trafficking, and help seeking for post-sexual violence experiences. as has been shared, I'm very recently Dr. Bloom, and right now I'm wearing a handful of hats as I'm trying to figure out my pathway for what's next for me. I currently work as a program manager at a healthcare company, and I focus on incentive programming for Medi-Cal populations. I also teach some public health courses at San Diego State University for undergrads. I love working with undergrads, and some master's students at the University of Southern California. And something I'm very proud of, alongside a friend and colleague of mine, I recently started a consulting company called Site of Change, which is focused on program planning, implementation, and evaluation. We have a lot of exciting projects and partners we're working with, and all are centered around education and equity, including a project or two on violence prevention, which is very near and dear to my heart. And that leads me to the content of this talk today. I was approached to give this lecture by Bill, as the content of this work was published not too long ago in the Journal of Sexuality Education. And this was such an exciting invitation to receive, given that this work was part of my dissertation and it's data I collected myself. So I feel deeply connected to this work, and I'm so excited to share it with you all today. So without further ado, my talk today is going to be on the responsiveness of sex education to the needs of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or LGBTQ+ undergraduate students. And I'd like to start us off by giving a brief background on sexual violence and sexual harassment, herein called SVSH, through this presentation. SVSH are pervasive and well-documented problems on university campuses, both in the United States and abroad. Sexual violence is a very broad term, and it is defined as forcing or manipulating another person into unwanted sexual activity without their consent, regardless of their relationship to the victim in any setting. And this includes a number of acts ranging from sexual harassment to attempted and completed rape and sexual assault. And research shows that nearly 48% of college students will experience sexual harassment while in college. However, there are certain student populations that are more vulnerable to SVSH, and this includes women, it includes students of color, it includes sexual and gender minority students, referred to herein as LGBTQ+ students, among others. And also very important to point out is that students with multiply minoritized or intersectional identities are often at highest risk for experiencing sexual violence and sexual harassment. And SVSH is associated with a handful, numerous really, adverse health effects, including anxiety, depression, and substance use, even death. And in the context of a person's educational and career goals, experiencing sexual violence also has significant negative impacts on a student's experiences in school, including lowering their GPA. They have a higher likelihood of dropping out of school altogether. And there's even data out there that shows it is associated with a reduced lifetime earning potential. And so what I'd like to next do is zoom in on the LGBTQ+ student community and what we know about their experiences of sexual violence and sexual harassment. So students who are sexual minority or gender minorities are at increased risk of experiencing SVSH both before and during college. And this increased vulnerability to sexual violence and sexual harassment is due in part to higher rates of poverty, discrimination, marginalization, and hate-motivated violence. And specifically, we know through the research that's out there that LGBTQ+ students experience sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking at nearly 2 times the rate of their non-LGBTQ+ peers, with bisexual and transgender female students being at the highest risk. And as I just went over in the previous slide, SVSH is detrimental to any student who experiences it. But the data out there indicates that the mental and physical outcomes may be worse for LGBTQ+ students, as LGBTQ+ students experience higher levels of trauma symptoms, depression, and substance use issues after experiencing sexual violence compared to their non-LGBTQ plus peers. And in addition, LGBTQ plus students are less likely to seek resources or counseling after such experiences. And this likely hinders coping with experiences of sexual violence and further exacerbating health disparities that we know exist in this population. And so the next really important background piece is sex education, but not just any type of sex education, comprehensive sex education. And while there are a handful of really great sex education curricula out there, today I just want to give a brief overview of UNESCO's International Technical Guidance on Sex Ed. Big picture, UNESCO has put together 8 blocks of topics that when utilized together makes up a truly comprehensive sex education program curriculum. I'm not going to go over each of these in detail. I don't have the time to do that this evening, unfortunately. But I do want to highlight some of the pertinent information that these 8 blocks include, starting with that really pretty pink box on the screen. And that starts with relationships. And this would include information on friendship, on love and romantic relationships and tolerance, inclusion and respect, values, rights, culture, and sexuality. In the yellow box, we see understanding gender, including the social construction of gender and gender norms, gender equality, stereotypes, bias, and gender-based violence. The next block, violence and staying safe. This includes topics like consent, privacy and bodily integrity, safe use of information, and safe usage of communication technologies. Next is the skills for health and well-being, which includes, again, communication, refusal and negotiation skills, media literacy, and sexuality, and finding help and support. Those last 3 boxes that you see in the green, purple, and lighter blue box are things that you generally probably think of when you think about sex education. And those are topics like human body and development, including sexual and reproductive anatomy, reproduction, puberty, sexual and sexual behavior, like the sexual life cycle, and then sexual and reproductive health, where we talk about pregnancy prevention, HIV and AIDS stigma and care, and then recognizing and reducing the risk of STIs. And ultimately, the goal of a truly comprehensive sex education program is, and I'm using this quote from the UNESCO curricula, is about providing young people with an evidence-based understanding of their sexual and reproductive health, and to give them the skills to talk with their peers, their families, and their communities about really complicated issues such as relationships, gender, puberty, and consent. So next, I would like to talk about the LGBTQ plus student population and comprehensive sex education, which I will oftentimes call CSE. So comprehensive sex ed, or CSE, is a promising intervention for addressing sexual violence and sexual harassment among college populations. And when this is delivered in early adolescence, research shows that comprehensive sex education is associated with reduced SVSH victimization and reduced acceptance of social norms that are associated with sexual violence. And an example of a social norm would be physical violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflict within a relationship. It's also associated with a reduction in rape myths. An example of a rape myth would be only certain types of women or certain types of people get raped, all of which promote sexual violence and sexual harassment. CSE is also associated with less engagement in activities that coincide with SVSH perpetration. These are things like monitoring somebody's phone, monitoring somebody's social media, and also improved resource seeking and coping for experiences of sexual violence and sexual harassment. CSE sounds pretty legit, I think. And so while CSE is supposed to be comprehensive in nature, unfortunately, in practice, which is probably no surprise to most folks who are on the call today, CSE comes in many shapes, sizes, and forms. And though there are both national and international CSE guidelines available, like the ones that we just went over from UNESCO, the sex education that students receive is typically not consistent and it's not comprehensive. Specifically for the context of this presentation, a key critique of sex education programming is that it may not be adequately tailored in ways that support the LGBTQ plus youth, or it's probably not responsive to their needs, especially as it relates to sexual violence and sexual harassment. In fact, research shows that less than 5% of LGBTQ plus youth indicate they even have positive discussions about LGBTQ plus topics in their sex education classes or at their schools. And that less than 8% of schools, even in states and school systems where it's allowed to talk about LGBTQ plus content, less than 8% actually implement it into their curriculum. And ultimately, the non-inclusivity of sex education is a concern, especially given the high rates of sexual violence and sexual harassment among LGBTQ plus students. And so more work is needed to explore exposure to sex education, specifically among LGBTQ plus students, and its responsiveness to their needs, including how it relates to sexual violence and sexual harassment. And so there were two main aims that guided this study, and I'm going to go over both of them with you today. The first is to describe the differences in the pre-college formal and informal sex education content and sources. So two things, the content and the sources that were reported by LGBTQ plus students and non-LGBTQ plus students. And the second aim of this presentation and the paper that this is based off of is to assess the perceived usefulness of sex education and its responsivity to LGBTQ plus needs. So I'm going to go over methods next. Some folks might think this part's a little boring, but I really love some methods work. So I think it's important to understand how this data was collected. And so I used a sequential explanatory mixed methods design, which sounds kind of complicated, but it's really quite easy to understand. And I've created a little graphic here to help ease the mouthiness of the methodology. But essentially what this means is that quantitative data is collected first. That's typically like survey data. And it's later followed up by qualitative data. And that's something like an in-depth interview or a focus group. And the qualitative data or the in-depth interviews are typically used to help explain the quantitative findings, in this case, a survey, and to provide additional information and context for it. And the data for this paper, this presentation, comes from the Let's Talk About Sex Education study, which focused on understanding students' exposure to sex education and its impact on their sexual and romantic relationships and their experiences of sexual violence and sexual harassment, both before and during college. So from August to December of 2019, I recruited 300 undergraduate students from the University of California system. 3 campuses in particular, UC San Diego, UC Los Angeles, and UC Santa Barbara. These 300 students completed a quantitative survey. Students were recruited through lots of strategies, including the online and physical distribution of this really cute flyer that I created, which is displayed to your left. And based on the responses to some of the key demographic information on that survey, a subset of 59 students were invited to participate in a semi-structured in-depth interview. 20 of the 59 students identified as LGBTQ+. And so for the purposes of this paper, this presentation today, we're not going to focus on those 59 students. We're going to only focus on the 20 in-depth interviews of students who identified as LGBTQ+. And the in-depth interviews focused on students' exposures to formal and informal sex ed. It asked students to discuss how well they thought their pre-college sex education prepared them for sex and relationships in college. And we also asked how they felt their sex education equipped them with skills related to sexual violence and sexual harassment. I'm going to briefly go over the methods that I use, specifically the quantitative methods. And the first are the demographic variables. So we collected information on age, which was our only continuous variable, and then a handful of others that were measured categorically, including gender identity, sexual orientation, and race ethnicity. And I've provided the categories that we asked right here on the slide for you. We also asked some general questions about students' education, such as where they attended high school, namely in California, outside of California, or outside of the United States altogether. And we asked them when they first received sex education. We asked students some more in-depth question about their sex education history, in particular, including the content that was included in their sex ed. We use kind of buckets of information that we knew would be typically included in a comprehensive sex ed curricula. So that would include whether they learned how to say no to sex, sexual pleasure, consent, sexual violence, among some other topics that are listed on the slide for you. And students indicated whether they did or did not receive education on those topics. And for every topic that a student said, yes, I learned about this, we asked them where they learned about that topic. And we provided a list of entities where a student might have received sex education on a specific topic. And this included informal, like at home with parents or friends, through the internet, which would include pornography and social media, formal education, like what you would think about in a classroom, and then maybe a healthcare provider or a doctor. And finally, we asked students 5 questions about how useful they felt the sex education they received was around navigating romantic sexual relationships, personal desires related to sex, personal boundaries related to sexual relationships and activities, and consent. Next, I'm going to just briefly talk about the analytical component of this work, and I'm going to start with the quantitative aspect, since that's the data that we collected first. So data collection and analysis occurred in 2 distinct phases and ended in the integration and interpretation of both the quantitative and qualitative findings. And for the first phase, I used those 300 survey responses from the undergrads from UC San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Los Angeles, who completed the Qualtrics survey. I ran descriptive stats so I could understand who participated in the survey. And in order to determine the differences in the content and the sources of sex education between LGBTQ+ and non-LGBTQ+ students, I used Pearson chi-squared tests, or for cells that had less than 5 responses, I used Fisher exact tests. I also used independent samples t-tests to determine differences in the perceived usefulness of sex ed between LGBTQ+ and non-LGBTQ+ students. And then moving on to the qualitative aspect, which again happened after we collected the quant data. I first cross-checked the transcription accuracy of the 20 in-depth interviews among the LGBTQ+ students. And using the existing, albeit limited, data and literature that's available on sex education and sexual violence and sexual harassment as a dyad, and the study objectives, I created an initial list of codes a priori. This is also referred to as a deductive approach to qualitative analysis. I then used an inductive approach through thematic analysis for data familiarization and high-level code generation, which helped me identify and analyze and report patterns, or what we call themes, within the data. I then took these codes to an Excel document where myself and another coder created a matrix, and we went back and forth on what quotes formed which themes until we reached a consensus. And so now I'm excited to jump into the data. And first things first, I want to give you an idea of who participated in the study and present the demographic characteristics and educational histories of the students. So you'll see the first column in this light beige color represents the 300 students who participated in the online Qualtrics survey. In the middle column, or the kind of yellow color, you'll see the 70 students who identified as LGBTQ plus that 300. And then finally, in the far corner, that kind of sage green color, is the 20 LGBTQ plus students who participated in an in-depth interview. So briefly, the majority of participants identified as female, though among the LGBTQ plus students in that yellow middle column, you can see that 17% identified as male, 10% identified as transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, or other. Moving down to sexual orientation, as you can see, the majority of our overall sample identified as heterosexual. However, when you move over to the middle column, you can see that about 2/3 of our LGBTQ plus student population that we captured identified as bisexual, 21% identified as homosexual, and 3% identified as asexual. Moving down to race ethnicity data, you can see that our overall sample was somewhat diverse, the largest proportion of our students identifying as white, Asian, and Latinx, with about 14% identifying as more than one race or ethnicity. And then finally, you can see that the majority of our students attended high school in California. That's not super surprising given that we were asking questions on 3 California-based universities. But what was kind of cool is that we had 20% of our sample actually went to high school outside of the United States. And now moving on to the results. I want to first start with aim 1, which was to describe the differences in pre-college formal and informal sex education content and sources reported by LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus students. So starting at the very top, talking about content. Using chi-squared analyses, we wanted to see if there were differences in the sex ed content that LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus students received before attending college. And we found that LGBTQ plus students were significantly less likely to report being taught how to say no to sex compared to their non-LGBTQ counterparts. And we did not find any other differences between the LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus student population in other areas of content, including STIs, HIV, violence in relationships, learning about healthy relationships, consent. The whole gamut is listed there for you, but there were no differences in any of that, which was good. Next, we wanted to ask about sources of sex ed. And so to see if there were any differences in the sex ed sources between LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus students, we again used chi-squared analysis. But here we actually found quite a few differences, with LGBTQ plus students indicating that they were more likely to use the media, meaning internet, pornography, social media, etc., as their primary source of information for sex education on these 6 topics. And that included birth control, relationships, religious and cultural views of sex, masturbation, violence in relationships, and consent. Now, what I think the coolest part of this is the integration of the qualitative or the in-depth interviews. And we were really excited. I was really excited because the qualitative data really did help provide context and provided some additional information based on what we found quantitatively with the survey. So in the analysis of the in-depth interviews, it was revealed that LGBTQ plus students actually did lean on the internet for sex education, and that it wasn't always a bad thing. In fact, there were a handful of positives that LGBTQ plus students shared, including that the internet filled gaps for them. I have quotes provided here. I won't be reading all of them for you this evening, but I'll highlight some of the key takeaways and read a few where appropriate. But this particular student said that they taught themselves sex education and sought answers online because they didn't have any other outlets, and that their school was not doing enough to answer their questions as a trans student. Next, we found that LGBTQ plus students also said that using the media, having to go online for sex education, provided practical knowledge for them, specifically for real life experiences, including about learning about the existence of trans people and how gay or lesbian folks engage in sexual activities. This student said, most of the knowledge I gained was from online resources through random Google browsing and fan fiction. And through that, I learned that this is how homosexual people have sex, whether they be gay men or lesbian women, or that trans people actually exist. I didn't know it was an actual thing because it was never mentioned in front of me anywhere. While some students did share that there were positives of using the internet for sex ed, they also shared many of the dangers. And one of our participants talked about how learning sex ed through pornography led her to develop unhealthy beliefs and habits, including behaviors that she thought at once was normal and healthy, including non-consensual sexual interactions, lacking condom use, and hypermasculinity. And further, LGBTQ plus students felt that using the internet as a primary source of sex education actually increased their vulnerability to sexual violence and sexual harassment. I think this quote is just so powerful. And so while many of these themes or topics had multiple quotes, I really wanted to focus on some of the ones that kind of just took my breath away while I was listening to them and collecting this data, and also as I was writing this, and even as I share it with you all here today. But this was a cisgender male student who identified as gay, and he indicated that he didn't remember losing his virginity, doesn't remember the face of who. He wished he was taught earlier how to be responsible and how to be safe and learn about sex in general. And I feel he said he felt like he didn't learn a lot. He had to learn through real life experiences. And there were moments when it was really unpleasant and it was hurting and it was really awful and they couldn't get themselves out of it. The consenting part for sure. He felt like when he was on Grindr, he was always pressured or needed to do something quickly and rushed into things that he didn't. And so this student reflected on using the use of online dating apps, another aspect of online having to access sex education, relationships, connections, et cetera, online because it wasn't offered formally. And so with that, I'm going to move on to the second aim, which was to assess the perceived usefulness of sex education and its responsivity to LGBTQ plus student needs. This is where I used independent samples t-tests to determine differences in the means and responses related to the usefulness of sex education. And we found that sex education was less useful for LGBTQ plus students compared to their non-LGBTQ plus peers related to two key areas. And one was helping navigate personal desires related to sex. And the second was in navigating sexual consent. Two really important aspects, especially as we consider the connection to sexual violence and sexual harassment. And so again, we found that our quantitative findings were supported by our qualitative data that we collected among the LGBTQ plus students. So for the in-depth interviews, we found that LGBTQ plus students discussed the consequences of having sex education that was non-inclusive and not useful or responsive to their needs. And so I'm going to go over some additional quotes. So first, LGBTQ plus students indicated that they experienced othering through their sex education. And this is a term that refers to an individual or a group attributing negative or non-normative characteristics to those that they feel are opposite of them. And they also discussed feeling being silenced or having their ideas, questions, and voice intentionally and consciously withheld through their sex education experiences. And again, while there's only one quote that's highlighted here in the paper, which I hope y'all check out, there were 3 or 4 students that talked specifically about this experience of being in a classroom when sex education is being taught, writing down a question that a teacher said would be anonymously read to the class, and essentially having their questions being ignored or silenced altogether after it was read out loud. And this student in particular raised their hand. This wasn't one of the more anonymous types, but raised their hand and asked specifically about non-straight relationships. And the teacher responded, yeah, those exist, but that's not most people, so we're not going to talk about it. Other students said that they experienced erasure through their sex education. And the definition of that is a heteronormative cultural practice of removing, dismissing, or downplaying queer groups from public record or view. And the 2 quotes here highlight that the students felt that sex education was generally centered around cis hetero people and experiences, and that non-cis het identities nor their sexual experiences are ever really included. The quote here says, I didn't know anything about what trans people experience, how people of the same gender would have sex with each other, or about asexuality. I didn't even know that existed. And on the bottom, a quote from a transgender male student who identified as mostly homosexual just said, there's no education on trans people at all. I've never gotten any sexual training on trans sex education. The other consequences that LGBTQ plus students shared was perceived vulnerability and other health-related consequences. 2 really powerful quotes here. The first from a transgender male student who identified as mostly homosexual, said that the sex education that they received was really lacking in areas that were personal to their life. And that if they had received more comprehensive sex ed, maybe they wouldn't have had so many issues related to their SVSH experiences, specifically relating to boundary setting and communication. And what I really loved about this particular quote is they tied it directly to sex ed. They said, I really feel if I knew consent and had built a better mindset around boundaries and how to control the sex or hookup in that situation, it would have really helped me. And if I would have known at an earlier age, I would have been stricter about using condoms, and that would have made me less at risk for STIs. Education needs to start when you're a kid. And I think a lot of the sex education I received was lacking in areas that are personal to my life. And I'll let y'all read the rest of that quote. And there is a second quote that I pulled here that talked about sex education being inadequate and outdated, and that a lot of the students who the LGBTQ plus students that I interviewed felt were at risk were the ones that are left out of these conversations altogether. And this student said, they are more at risk of STIs and other things. So why are we not educating this group of people? I think sex ed is really the key to help minimize sexual assault, violence, and unwanted sexual encounters. So some really powerful quotes related to how students felt when their sex education was not inclusive or useful to their needs. So what I went over today, I think I've shared this a few times, so sorry for the reiteration, is that it's just a snapshot of all of the incredible quotes and stories that the students shared with me and with my team. And so I hope all of you will check out that paper to read and learn further, or reach out to me if you want to chat about it further. And so with that, I'm going to start closing out this talk by discussing the conclusion and some of the significance of this work. And so first, evaluation of current teaching practices and updated policies are needed, especially those that address existing gaps in sex ed, including for vulnerable student populations. In this study, LGBTQ plus students indicated that their sex ed was less helpful related to outcomes associated with sexual violence and sexual harassment. This included things like navigating sexual consent and expressing personal desires and boundaries as they relate to sex. And further, they were less likely to report that sex education taught them how to say no to sex that they did not want to engage in. If we place these findings within the realities of sex education in the United States, especially today, I think this makes complete sense. And given that less than 25% of states are required to include information related to sexual orientation or LGBTQ plus identities, and only 11 states, including here in California where I reside, and the District of Columbia, only 11 states actually teach consent, teach healthy relationships, or teach about sexual assault in their sex ed curriculum. These are huge gaps, and it is no wonder that LGBT expressing that they haven't received inclusive sex ed and they are not being taught these topics, which are so crucial to understanding and preventing sexual violence and sexual harassment. We have to do more to ensure that all students, regardless of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, are receiving high quality and inclusive sex ed that meets their needs. And evaluating current teaching practices is an appropriate first step. Second, considering our findings related to online vulnerability specifically, or vulnerability due to needing to seek out information, resources, networks online and through media, our sex ed curriculum must be updated to address the vulnerabilities of students online. Again, placing our findings within the context of current research and what we know. 1 in 5 youth experience unwanted online exposure to explicit materials. And for LGBTQ plus youth, these dangers are higher, the rates are higher. LGBTQ plus youth are more likely to be asked to send sexually explicit materials to folks online. And this is why it's so important to either follow those UNESCO guidelines that I went over earlier, or another entity that promotes that truly comprehensive sex education. Because as we talked about, online and media safety is absolutely included in many of those education blocks that I talked about. And finally, what I think the biggest takeaway of this work is that sex ed can really cause harm when it's not inclusive. And when it doesn't meet the needs of all students. Truly comprehensive sex education is linked to better physical health, mental health, and sexual health outcomes. But for LGBTQ plus students in particular, comprehensive sex education has been linked to decreased substance use, better communication and sexual negotiation skills, and less internalized homophobia. While it's not published on this slide, I just want to take a moment and say, while yes, there are many strengths, I think, to this work, there are also some limitations. First, this data is cross-sectional and it was derived from a non-randomized convenience sample. And ultimately, this means that while our findings are, I think, interesting and important, they're not representative of all students in California or all LGBTQ plus students. And second, given that the in-depth interviews covered really sensitive topics like sex and sexuality, sexual assault, we know that social desirability bias may have been an issue, but nevertheless, we still got some really vulnerable and incredible quotes, I think, from our participants. And lastly, I picked out 3 main areas of significance of this work, which I think in many ways are tied to the conclusions I just went over, but kind of are gonna take us home. And so the first is that this work proposes changes to sex ed curriculum at multiple levels of the education sector. Researchers, educators, policymakers alike can all continue to make progress on ensuring youth have access to comprehensive and inclusive sex education by 1, advocating for or mandating the implementation of a truly comprehensive sex education curriculum that's backed by CECUS or UNESCO or other evidence-based programming. 2, ensuring that teachers who are responsible for teaching sex ed have received training and actually feel comfortable discussing all of the curriculum topics and don't leave anything out. And if not, find someone else to do it, like an external person. And 3, to work on removing state level legal and policy barriers to LGBTQ plus inclusive sex ed programming. And also, I think a really important tidbit to add here is that there's really growing evidence for colleges and universities to step up and play a role in providing comprehensive sex ed, especially for first-year students who we know are at increased risk of experiencing sexual violence in their first year and may not have received sex ed at all before entering into a college or university setting. This could be enacted in a myriad of ways, including the inclusion of sex ed as an elective course, creating a requirement for incoming students, and or including CSE within campus-based sexual violence and prevention efforts. The second is that this work contributes to the growing but limited evidence that supports that comprehensive sex education does play a role in sexual violence and sexual harassment prevention. There's probably about 24 or so articles on this connection between sex education and sexual violence. And it is so important for educators and researchers out there to continue to build this evidence base, especially for CSE curriculum, by partnering together and to determine its impact on SVSH prevention and positive health outcomes for vulnerable youth. In the context of this presentation today, specifically LGBTQ+ youth. And finally, this work highlights the voices and the experiences of marginalized student populations, again, specifically LGBTQ+ students. One of the goals of this work for me was to really allow for students' voices and experiences to be highlighted and prioritized. And by asking the students directly what they wish they would have known related to sex ed or before they step foot on a college and university campus, and giving them the opportunity to share their lived experiences was an absolute privilege. I have other papers in the works. All are focused on sex education among specific student groups, and many of these are students that aren't often considered in undergraduate institutions when it comes to topics like sexual violence in particular. And so I hope this work will continue to highlight student voice and ultimately help prevent violence from happening before it occurs. I would be remiss if I didn't add a few acknowledgements and some funding acknowledgements, including my co-authors, Talia, Dr. Reed, Dr. Yoa, and Dr. Wagman. Of course, my undergraduate researchers who helped me recruit and interview participants, Talia, Christine, Trey, Vidisha, and Angelica. And the undergrads who participated in this work, especially the LGBTQ+ students who shared their experiences with me. The funding we got from a whole bunch of places, 2 of which were from a parent grant, 3 of which I obtained myself, being the Phi Kappa Phi Love of Learning Award and the Dissertation Award, and then the Western Regional Public Health Training Center Award. And I think I've left enough time for questions. I want to say thank you again so much for having me, and happy to talk more. So I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Brittany. That was a terrific presentation, very informative. Stephanie, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
We do not have any questions.
Okay, well, folks, think of your questions and pop them in the Q&A. And if anybody wants to come on video or audio, just raise your virtual hand and we will welcome you to the space and you can ask your question. But meanwhile, I'm curious, Brittany, on a lot of your research echoes what Lisa Lieberman and Eva Goldfarb found in their 3 decades of research, 3 decades of sex ed article. Are you familiar with that one?
I think I'm vaguely familiar with it.
Okay, well, then that may be the answer to my question. I was wondering if your study, I was wondering about the timing of that, and if your study bolstered their findings or vice versa. But maybe they both came out concurrently.
They may have, there's been so much great work done on sex education through the decades. And I think we're in a space right now where we're trying to figure out what has worked and what has not worked over the decades of trying to push for more comprehensive and inclusive sex ed. We've seen a lot of great progress and we've seen a few things fall flat. And so I'm definitely going to have to revisit that. I'm not sure who their sounds a little bit more comprehensive than mine, since I was focused on a very specific student population.
Well, yeah, and they were focused on a wide variety of factors that influence or that produce outcomes related to sex ed that are not traditionally measured when we're strictly looking at teen pregnancy prevention, for example. So they definitely touch on inclusivity. They definitely touch on sexual violence. But I think what might be new to me is, the reverse of my assumptions, which is that education that's not inclusive can cause harm. So that resonated with me when you noted that, and I should have remembered that from when I read your paper before, but it stuck with me. I have another question. Unless Stephanie, if you have something, or if somebody else has something.
No, go ahead, Bill.
Okay. My other question is, you put out some recommendations, and my question would be, like, if you were to zero in on one thing that you would like to change, or see change in sexuality education, if you had a magic wand and this could happen, what would that be?
Oh my gosh. That's such a good question, but such a tough question. Honestly, I think really highlighting all, like, throwing out the policies and things that I think educators who are really well-intentioned really can't do much about, because they have these laws in place that in some ways prevent them from providing inclusive sex ed. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't. They'd get in trouble for doing that. So I think maybe that's where I would start, is just get rid of these policies and laws that prevent actual comprehensive sex education from being implemented in schools. And then I think we might see more folks willing to come forward and actually teach it in a way that benefits all students, especially if they're already following an evidence-based curriculum, like what we see with CCUS or UNESCO. Yeah.
That's a good magic wand. None of us have a crystal ball, but I'm going to be a little more pessimistic and see, with the emergence of the don't say gay laws, that it's the trends of the Supreme Court. I'm not having a very positive, optimistic outlook.
Neither am I, and that's why my original answer to that was like, make sure our teachers are better trained and feel more comfortable. But then if I had a magic wand, like, I'm going to go for the tip of the top. Like, let's go and get rid of all of these problematic policies and things that are preventing folks from living their best and most healthy lives. And all of the things that you just said, Bill, just really tug at my heartstrings for so many reasons.
Yeah, and I echo your prioritization of professional development and teacher training. That's absolutely needed, and our schools and our government need to invest more if we really do want to have a positive outcome.
We do have one question that just came in. Since much better information becomes available outside of the classroom, is there a solid way to kind of advertise these better sites to students?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, as we all know, we've all just lived through such a huge period of misinformation. We are still living through it in many aspects beyond sex education, which is like a completely different topic, and we could all talk for hours and hours about. I think if we continue to teach students, specifically young students, how to access not only the internet safely, but also to have like a real lens of who funded this work, where is this information coming from the get-go, and point them to evidence-based sources like UNESCO, like CCUS, for example, to cross-check information that they might be finding on Twitter or Tumblr or Instagram or TikTok or there's all of these great places that I think students find information, especially when they don't have access to the information formally, or so many students in my study, for example, didn't know any other LGBTQ plus student or a family member. They were the only person that they knew that had these that shared these identities, their identities. And so trying to help, I guess, guide students into where the evidence-based information is, and then just encouraging them to cross-check that with anything else that they find online would be really important. I don't have a better answer for that. I think misinformation is such a huge issue online, with positives and negatives in our current electronic world that we live in.
Yeah. All right. Stephanie, I don't see any other questions. Do you have any questions before we wrap up?
No, we're all set.
Brittany, any final notes before we go to our final notes?
No, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to share my work. I hope it makes a difference somewhere, whether someone's watching this today, live streaming it, watching it later, or trying to implement something in their classrooms. This is so important, and we all deserve to have good, comprehensive, and inclusive sex ed. So thank you all very much.
For sure. And folks, there's a copy of Dr. Bloom's article in the chat. So you should be able to access that. And I know that, well, I want to say thank you so much to Brittany for speaking, and Stephanie for setting up this lecture and working with me behind the scenes. And yep, there we have a whole bunch of links. Thanks, Stephanie. So there's the evaluation link. So please be sure to fill that out if you want your ASECT or CFLE credits. And even if you don't, we always welcome the feedback. There's a link for slides so that you can have a copy of Brittany's slides. And then, as always, we have the links for both the proposals, if you'd like to submit something to be a speaker, and if you would like to, if you need some financial assistance, then there's the link for the sliding scale program. So next week's lecture is going to be Sexual Health is Public Health, the deconstruction of sex-negative public health practices, with Dr. Alicia Andrews. And then there's links for all of the upcoming sessions. And actually, we just loaded a whole lot of new stuff onto the website. So Stephanie and I have been busy. I think we have the calendar populated through September, maybe even into a little bit into October, don't we? I don't know if it's all up on the website yet, but we've been busy, right, Stephanie?
Definitely.
And then there's the recorded lectures. Like, we're closing in on 100 recorded lectures, so there's a lot to choose from there. So thanks so much for spending your afternoon or evening with us, and thank you again, Dr. Bloom, and have a great night, everybody.